At the Society of Actuaries Research Institute, we recently released a research report on interstate variations in mortality in the United States from 1959 through 2018. You can find the report on the SOA website, and also the resulting data set is freely available at the United States Mortality Database website at usa.mortality.org upon registration. The report author, Dr. Magali Barbieri from the University of California at Berkeley, is here today to discuss the report, including new information that's also available now for 2019. So Magali, how large are we seeing the geographic differences in mortality in the United States today?
Hi, Dale. Hi, everyone. The difference across the states in the US in terms of mortality or life expectancy are actually pretty large. So for instance, in 2019, there was a more than 7 years difference between the most advantaged or the least advantaged states in the US. To say exactly, to state the numbers exactly, I would say 7.5 years for men and about 7 for women, which is a big difference. So the highest mortality states are for men, it is Mississippi with a length of life, an average length of life of 71.5 years. And the most advantaged state, again for men, is California with a life expectancy at birth of nearly 80 years. And for women, the difference is between 77.7 years for West Virginia and nearly 85 years, which is pretty high for Hawaii. And just to give you a sense of how important that difference is, it would take more than 35 years for Mississippi and West Virginia to catch up to the level of survival that's now recorded in California and Hawaii. And this is just taking the average improvement over the past 50 years. If we concentrate on the last 10 years, the situation is not actually even worse, because over the past 10 years, we've seen a decline in the life expectancy at birth for the high mortality states, while the states with lower mortality have seen a continuous increase. So the divergence has accelerated.
That's a really helpful way to look at it. You know, another part of this research that I really enjoyed when we were doing it is looking at these trends longitudinally as well. So how have these statistics changed over time?
So it's interesting to look at the difference between the geographic landscape in terms of how long people live at the beginning of the period we've looked at, which is the early 1960s, and compare with what we see now. And there's been a really marked shift in the geography of life expectancy at birth in the US. So in the early 1960s, there was a strip of land that included all the states from Louisiana on the west up to the Carolinas on the east, which were the states concentrating the highest level of mortality, the lowest level of life expectancy. But then over the past 50 years, there's been a change in the sense that states on the east of that strips, meaning Georgia and the Carolinas, have actually seen a pretty nice improvement. But other states, so this cluster has actually increased to include states surrounding Mississippi, which is the center of gravity of this high mortality cluster. And so there's been a drift to the south west, let's say, of this cluster.
I know in the research, there's a wide variety of different patterns that have merged. So what are some of the similarities and differences in these historical mortality patterns that happen across the United States?
So let's start with the similarities. So for the whole time span between the early 60s and the current period, we can distinguish three broad time periods. So the first one is the 1960s. The second one runs from the 70s to about 2010, and then the last one covers the last decade. And all of the states in the US have gone through the three stages illustrated by these three time periods. So the first time period, the 1960s, corresponded to a plateau. There was no improvement in mortality after the strong decline that had been exhibited for the first half of the 20th century, and which was driven by a control of infectious disease. By the 1960s, infectious disease had reached a really low level in terms of mortality, and cardiovascular disease had become the leading cause of death, and they had actually increased over time due to a number of factors, but mostly driven by things like smoking and the inability at the time, the lack of medical knowledge to control this disease. And then during the 1960s, again, when mortality was pretty stable, there was a number of innovation in terms of prevention, treatment, and care of this kind of disease. And so starting around 1968 and up to the early 1970s, depending on the state, it was a turning point where mortality started declining very quickly during the 70s and 80s, a little bit more slowly in the 90s and 2000s, again, mostly driven by what was happening in terms of controlling cardiovascular mortality. And then in 2010, there was, again, a change in trend. At the national level, this translated into a stop in improvement. So there was no more progress in terms of life expectancy at birth. And starting in 2014, there was actually a reversal. So the average length of life actually declined between 2014 and 2017, and up to 2018, depending on the state. And then it seemed that in 2019, there was a little uptake. So a new increase in life expectancy at birth. And of course, we know what happened in 2020 and 21. So depending on the state, since 2010, some states continue improving, but at a much slower rate as the previous period. And some states, most states actually, saw a deterioration. And unfortunately, the deterioration was stronger in the states which already had high mortality. So there was an increased divergence across the states in the US. The one exception is Washington, DC, which experienced a really incredible improvement, as in the 1990s, Washington, DC was not only, it was the state with the worst level of mortality, it was much below any other state. And then it's caught up in a way that in 2019, it's actually close to the top. But except for that, all of the states that had high mortality in the early period have actually seen a faster deterioration.
Magali, some really, really good information here, not only for actuaries and our SOA members to digest, but also other researchers, and I'm sure the public as well. Want to thank you for sure for stopping by to discuss this really helpful report on interstate variations in mortality in the United States. Feel free to shoot us a note. Contact us at research@soa.org. This interstate variations in mortality in the US report can be found on the SOA website, soa.org, by clicking on the Research Institute tab and then pull down and see mortality and longevity reports from that drop-down menu. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about this research project from the Society of Actuaries Research Institute.